Good morning, everyone. My name is Madeline Daniels. I'm an associate planner here with the Planning, Zoning, and Land Use Unit in Oakland County, planning local business development. Welcome to today's virtual planners gathering, Oakland County Master Plan and Rezoning Review Process. Just a few reminders before we get started. One, the meeting is being recorded and will be made available on our website after today's discussion. And two, if you have any questions, please type them in the chat window in Zoom and direct them to Ryan Dividoc, who will moderate the Q&A session after the presentation. So let's go ahead and get started. It's my pleasure to introduce our presenter, Scott Kree, Principal Planner, Oakland County Planning and Local Business Development. Scott, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Madeline.
Mhm.
Well, welcome. Thank you for joining us, everyone. I'm Scott Kree, Principal Planner at Oakland County. I handle the state mandated function for the county. And today we will go through that a little bit. I will try to make it as non-boring as possible. But basically, this is just a formality that Oakland County partakes in, and I'll kind of give you the history of how that all came about, and other functions that I handle, and other people I work with within our building. So basically, this all starts out with our local governance of this whole thing. Oakland County currently has 63 communities consisting of CVTs, cities, villages, and townships. Um, Actually, we just got a 63rd as of last night. The Cass Lake Village, they were formally, the powers that be formally swore them in. So they are our 63rd community. But we do have another two communities, both Fenton and Northville, whose basically, their traditional downtowns, their cities were formed in other communities, such as Genesee County or Wayne County for Northville, Genesee County for Fenton. And over time, they have annexed property to become part of their city within Oakland County. So really, there's 60, now 61 communities that are fully within Oakland County, and then two of them have annexed in. So that's where we get the 63 number. Oakland County also shares borders with 20 other CVTs, six of which are counties. We have Wayne, Macomb, Livingston, Washtenaw, Genesee, and Lapeer. All these counties, the reasons why I list these out is because of my function here. These counties that are adjacent to us might handle this function differently, but all within the realm and the basically what the act and the law provides us to do. We do have, if you throughout our state, though, counties operate differently in how they handle planning and zoning. Many counties continue to have a planning commission and a master plan, and even some municipalities operate under under county zoning and planning. And you'll find that in the more rural areas of the state. Within our county, all 60, soon to be 63. I believe Cass Lake Village is still getting their planning commission together and going to develop a zoning ordinance and such. So that's very unique in the fact that we are experiencing that here in our time. So I'm watching that closely because it's never happened in my lifetime. But with that being said, there are communities out there that still rely on the county for much more planning operations and zoning operations. But within our county, all of our communities are self-sufficient in the fact that they have their own rules and laws when it comes to land use and zoning. So the Michigan Planning Enabling Act and the Zoning Enabling Act, with support of the Home Rule Acts, allows our local municipalities to govern themselves when it comes to land use. Different rules and different land regulations for each community. That's why there are different zoning there are different zoning ordinances for all of our communities, some of which are similar and some of which are different, depending on what your use is and what you're trying to do. And this also is guided by the master plan that they have adopted. Um, the Michigan Planning Enabling Act requires municipalities to review their master plans every 5 years. Now, the term review needs to be taken lightly in the fact that many planning commissions, they don't need to, they just need to make sure that the master plan is still going the direction they want, and it's still upholding what their community wants and how they want to gauge growth and projects and development and density. So every 5 years, a master plan does not need to be amended or updated, but it needs to be reviewed by the body. But within that, sometimes there are changes that need to be made, and that is where my office comes into play. Um, County and other reviewing jurisdictions are given a comment period once a master plan is amended or updated. And we also handle township rezonings. The timeline for these are if it's an amendment, which means you have a master plan and you're just amending a small portion of it, or there's just some minor changes you need to make to it. That's a 40-day review window that the county and other reviewing jurisdictions have. If it's an update, which means it's a whole new document, you're changing it from cover to cover. That's a 60-day review period for other reviewing jurisdictions. And then for township rezonings, which I'll get into a little bit later, we are allowed 30 days to review. So the Coordinating Zoning Committee, which is the committee that I report to, um, basically was formed in 1974, which I believe is when the um, Oakland County got rid of their planning commission. And so it's a recommendary board, and we were tasked to look at master plans and certain township rezonings. In 1982, the township rezoning portion was tweaked to be less involved, if you will, which I will get into that a little bit later. And so these are the governances that we operate under currently with the CZC. The current Coordinating Zoning Committee, the CZC that we call it, is made up of 3 Oakland County commissioners, which are usually taken from our Economic Development and Infrastructure Committee, which is a subcommittee of the Board of Commissioners. Currently, we have Commissioner Markham, Commissioner Weipert, and Commissioner Smith Charles sit on the coordinating zoning, and we've been lucky or blessed that we haven't had much change in our coordinating zoning committee, which is nice. I've been working, especially with Weipert and Markham, for quite a long time on this committee. But committees do change. It has changed since I've been doing this, and I've been doing this for about close to 9 years now. Um, so the CTC process allows Oakland County staff to review and make recommendations on community master plans and specific rezoning cases, and then present an outcome to the CZC, and the CZC then reviews it and then forms a recommendation that goes back to the community. So with that, I will basically go into what a master plan is. I understand that some of you are very familiar of what a master plan is. Others may not be that are on this call. So master plans obviously are basically the Michigan Association of Planning guides it. It's basically a future document that guides communities, policies, and stuff, but it is not a policy document. It's a guiding document. And basically it's adopted by either the Planning Commission or a local legislative body. But the master plan is not law, but it helps guide laws. So it helps guide regulations. It helps guide your zoning ordinance and your zoning maps and other functions of a city, village, or township. So basically, that's what I just said. So the master planning process involves a lot of people. Usually at the front end, we will see there's a lot of community involvement, or there should be, in the form of surveys, visioning sessions, and master plans. Um, much of the much of our review, um, once the plan is buttoned up and all these things are put into it, focuses on the future land use plan, particularly along municipality borders. One thing that we've been seeing lately is these master plans, especially for large swaths of land or certain other plans that a community might have, like as a pertaining to a corridor plan or what their infrastructure plan is or CIPs. They will have visionings for what they want development to look like, which we find that helps developers. Um, Many smart developers will look into a master plan to see how a community wants to grow and how they want to change and how they want to ultimately restrict or allow what development and what intensities they want in certain areas. And with that becomes the future land use plan. And the future land use plan, once again, it's a guiding document that's within the master plan, and it allows for basically it gives a map, if you will, of how the community is expecting the zoning map to change, or how zoning is expected to change. And a lot of times we'll see intensities or different changes increasing in density. Sometimes not. A lot of this is guided by infrastructure or growth patterns or corridor improvements or whatever it may be. From then, from there, the future land use plan usually feeds into the current zoning plan. And so that zoning plan will change based on the future land use plan. And if property owners or developers or if the community sees it fit to change their current zoning to match their future land use plan in certain areas. So that's kind of like the nitty gritty of master plan, at least and the portions that I focus on the most. The cover sheet for this presentation was this map here, which is a map that Brian and Maddie, who I work with, um, keep updated. It's basically a composite master plan, so it's not a one size fits all. Some things have to be changed to fit in certain categories. Every community is different, and it's hard when you have 62, 63 communities that all have different future land use classifications. So a master plan obviously is a guiding forecast growth plans and land use and regional systems. Those regional systems, especially when it's forecasting for growth trends, it's usually based on census data or property changes, infrastructure accessibility, like I said, CIPs and development prospects. And then the regional systems can be anything from access to transit to county drains to even school systems. Those all feed into how property and zoning changes within our communities. And lots of times that's guided by the master plan in what they see. And these master plans are usually 20-year plans. And obviously amendments can create a longer period of that. So whenever an amendment or an update is done to a master plan, that initiates a comment period for the county and other adjacent communities, as well as other jurisdictional authorities to have the option or the ability to review the master plan and comment on it. During the review and comment period, our office will go through a multitude of reviews and look at it. Our process is usually we review the master plan, we organize the data, we form a report, we give that report, a copy of that report to the community and the surrounding communities and other jurisdictional authorities, as well as to the CZC. The CZC will submit a recommendation. A recommendation letter will go out to the municipality, and then that municipality then has that recommendation letter for when whether it's their township board or their planning commission, or village council. It depends on who has the power to ultimately decide when the plan is done and ready for adoption, which changes throughout communities. And they will have that information of where the county sits on this subject. Granted, we are recommendary only. Okay, so it's a formality that it gets reviewed by us, but we might have recommendations that they're just that. They're recommendations. They are not law. So typically in the master plan, the overview of the master plan process is a letter is sent out with an intent that a community is going to update or amend their master plan. I have this dashed because that's sometimes we don't get a letter of intent, which is fine. I mean, I get it. Things happen. I used to be a consultant. I used to write master plans. It's not a huge deal. The main part is that usually you do want to make sure that the comment and review process period, that the correct authorities and jurisdictions are getting notified that you have a master plan and is being updated and reviewed during the comment period. We do have some communities that will reach out between them having a draft master plan and the review portion of that and the updating portion of that. They will reach out to us and sometimes have a meeting about what Oakland County's initiatives is, what best practices are we currently looking at. But that's also not a necessity. Each community does their own thing as long as the process of the review process is followed to the state statute of the law. So then there's distribution. This is the biggest portion. So obviously, if it's amendments, 42 days, updates, 63 days. Other reviewing jurisdictions uh, get the same opportunities. On the right there are our current, like so CVTs, so cities, villages, and townships that are within the area that are usually adjacent to the community. Also counties, if appropriate, that are adjacent to the municipality. Updating their master plan would have be able to review and comment during this period. Other organizations that we work with that we usually CC carbon copy on our letters and are informed, and sometimes we share comments with them, are the list at the right there. So the Water Resource Commission, the Road Commission, Oakland County Parks, if that's available, MDOT, if there's a rail line running through, CSX or CN rail is usually CC'd on our review and should be available to make comments. DTE and consumers, SMART, or even the sub-smarts like WODA and NODA, if their services or People's Express, if those services are within your community, SEMCOG, Metro Parks if it's appropriate, and airports. Oakland County currently has 3 airports within the county. So all those organizations would be made aware of the comment period. And then what we do at the county through my function is we again let them know just so they have a secondary uh, area to comment and they can let us know. We can share comments and kind of put stuff in our reviews before it goes to the coordinating zoning committee. Once it goes to the coordinating zoning committee, the current the community that's updating their master plan is invited, as well as everyone that's CC'd on this list here. And they're able to partake or at least listen in to basically the rundown of the review that my office has provided, and the coordinating zoning committee will weigh in with a recommendation, after which a formal letter with the existing comments goes to the municipality, and then the municipality has that in hand before their adoption, and they can make any changes that they see fit. So ideally, we're a third set of eyes, if you will, that is looking at this as all these other organizations are as well. And that's basically it. It's the way that the law is set up. It's supposed to be a very transparent process, and this is how Oakland County handles that process. Some recommendations, I mentioned we bring up recommendations. Some recommendations that our office will offer, some themes that we'll see are like brownfields. So a lot of these master plans will call for redevelopment. Well, in certain redevelopment cases, especially the re part means it's being redeveloped. It means that some of those protocols would fall into a brownfield sort of protocols that the state has. Oakland County has a BRA, or certain communities might have a BRA. So we like to see that information is in there and that they're planning for it. Complete streets, so mobility and multimodal. So complete streets, there is supposed to be a transportation function within the master plan by law. Environmental protection, we'll look for coordination with certain watershed councils and trail groups. Also, Oakland County back in 2017, with the help of Michigan State University, created a Michigan Natural Features Inventory of the county. We will utilize that to either prop up development or environmental or natural protections that they might have in their plan. And a lot of these recommendations are usually to help just make a master plan a little bit stronger or align it with certain initiatives or best practices. Granted, we have very smart communities, planning offices, planning commissions, and even planning consultants that operate, and we're lucky to have that given where Oakland County is in our population and our diversity to help guide these plans appropriately. But like I said, we're just a third set of eyes, and there's certain recommendations and services that we can do. Um, hazard mitigation planning. So one thing we'll see is like Oakland County has a hazard mitigation plan. Um, Hopefully we never have to use it, but it is something that we would like communities to acknowledge. Some communities have their own hazard mitigation plans. And one being is that if you recall, we've had some flooding issues. We do have a lot of lakes in Oakland County as well, and dams as well. And one thing is that if a catastrophic event does happen in your community and FEMA or powers that be, the federal government, and if you're trying to get financial assistance, a lot of times they want to see that you've been planning for this. So like if you're a community with a large lake that depends a lot on a dam, they want to see that you have provisions in your master plan and in other plans, whether it's your own hazard mitigation plan or if you're utilizing the county's hazard mitigation plan, that you're planning for if something bad was to happen. It shouldn't all be doom and gloom, but there's certain elements that have to be in there so you can get the most. It's like, okay, they were planning for it. They deserve, this is outside of their control. Housing. So Act 153 of 2024, which was a change to the Michigan Planning Enabling Act, basically requires that there's a housing element in all master plans. Since me doing this here for the last 9 years, I have not seen a master plan that does not address housing in some sort of capacity. Obviously, that's a state law. So there's somewhere else they were having issues with that. But we have a housing and neighborhood department that I will direct communities to if they have best practices that might not be covered in their master plan that they might want to be able to take from to address middle housing, attainable housing, workforce housing, affordable housing, whatever your community's looking to do within your master plan and how they're guiding the housing conversation. Also, household mitigation waste programs. So we just like to make sure that everyone has access. Um, we have at our office, we have the No Has program. We have between 15 and 19 northern, northwestern communities that don't have access to household appropriate household hazardous waste disposal programs. But there are other ones as you get further south in the county, such as SACRA, for example, and other parties like that that offer such programs. So we just want to make sure that that is also noted in your master plan and being being shown as a resource. Transit services, we have an Oakland County Transit group that works within our department. I rely on them to look at large master plans, usually large updates, to make sure that we're crossing the T's and dotting the I's of the services that are available or might be available. As you saw from my last lists, SMART or 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 the other parts of SMART, the NODAs and WODAs, the other transportation, they're usually CC'd on these so they can weigh in as well. Um, so that's another recommendation that we usually offer. And then sustainability opportunities. We do have a sustainability office here at Oakland County. And if there are items that are on the sustainability website, I will direct communities to at least look at them and see if that's something that might interest them to be on their master plan. But most of our communities do have a sustainability items within their master plan that I've seen. And then cross-disciplinary planning on all these. So many of our communities have many plans. Um, and we like to see that they're all talking to each other. So if you have a DDA plan or a corridor plan, and you're calling out for development changes in your downtowns or along specific corridors, we want to know that those plans are talking to each other appropriately. So we'll recommend that once in a while. That's usually not an issue, but sometimes it is. Sometimes there's a group out there that's developed a plan with the community and it didn't get recognized in the master plan. And we want to make sure that all the plans are moving in the right direction and talking to each other and not negating what the other one said. Um, so within our little department of about 14 people that we have in the planning department, I'll usually put at the end of every um, review what our services are. And these are services that are free to The community, obviously, we're always here being available. Environmental stewardship, historic preservation, planning, zoning, and land use, which is my little group with Ryan and Maddie. Trails, Water, and Land Alliance, Main Street, and brownfields, and then household hazardous waste program. So with that, that kind of concludes the master plan portion of this presentation. Next, we'll talk about the rezonings, which is only for townships. So the rezoning process, there are 21 townships in Oakland County currently. Um, and we have some very small ones such as Novi Township, Southfield Township, and Royal Oak Township are our smallest townships. In accordance with the changes in 1982, the Oakland County used to be able to review all the township rezonings, which would have been, I would have hated my life basically reviewing every township rezoning. Like we don't need that kind of oversight. So the powers that be changed it. So it's only, um, they meet either they're adjacent to another community, they're adjacent to Oakland County property or within 300 feet of Oakland County property, or they're owned by Oakland County. So it has to meet one multiple or one of these criteria for the coordinating zoning committee to get involved in a township rezoning. So the CZC's process is used for transparency purposes. We align having the master plan function here. We already know what the future land use plan is changing to and what it looks like. So when we do see changes to a future land use plan, especially when we're looking at border properties, we can assume that that property might be getting rezoned in some sort of time. So we kind of have the background already leading up to it. Typical CCC process for rezoning is we'll review a zoning proposal, organize the information, present it to the CZC, and then submit an outcome letter of recommendations to the municipality if we have any recommendations. Once again, we only get 30 days to do that. So we try to operate within that 30 days. A lot of our process will review historical data. So I'll look at past master plans and future land use plans, past zonings, growth patterns, historical imagery analysis. Now, the historical imagery analysis is probably the most fun part of this, in my in my opinion. If you haven't, I would urge everyone on the call, if you haven't been able to use our property gateway system, I think it's version 7.4 right now. It's online. It'll give you a history of property. We have aerial images that date all the way back to 1940. So and just as an example, this is where the county campus sits currently. So Dixie's up in the right-hand corner, and that's Telegraph with that curve in the middle of the property. This is 1940, 1963. You can see the campus developing. 1980, 2002, and then our latest aerials are 2025. They flew over in like March or April of 2025. I utilize this information because sometimes there'll be questions that pertain to why is this like this? Why is there industrial on top of residential? It's like, well, this was formed since, it's been like this since 1960 when there used to be a rail and now there's a trail there, but the industrial still exists from the rail, for example. So it helps to have this, and this is available to all communities, obviously, but sometimes I bring it up in my review just to basically be transparent about why things are the way they are, or why they're changing the way they are, or maybe they're changing back to something they once were, because a certain rezoning didn't work out for whatever reason. So I would urge everyone to, I mean, it's neat to see that. We have obviously, I just took a couple of them out, but we have things in between, like I think we have 1949 between 1940 and 1963. We have a multitude of them in the 2000s from 2000 to 2025. It's almost every 2 or 3 years. Um, so anyways, that's an art tool that we use in the rezoning process, and the overall rezoning process is similar to the master plan process. Sometimes I will have townships will contact me to try to figure out when the next coordinating zoning committee meeting will be, and we fit it within that 30-day review period so we don't upset their trajectory in how they are rezoning property, and basically being respectful of the township's timelines as well as the applicant's timelines, of how this all works out. If we do see issues, obviously we do bring them up. Um, so then there's still a distribution. That list that I showed earlier about who was CC'd in our review, sometimes that's minimized because depending on where the property is, we're not going to send send a copy of our review to MDOT if the property is not on a state trunk line, for example. But once again, we still write our review. We try to share comments with other jurisdictions and other authorities that might be reviewing the same rezoning. We present it to the CZC. The township is invited to that, as well as the neighboring township and any of the other reviewing jurisdictions, and then municipalities. Then the municipality has that, their planning commission has that. They can look at what the county said about the rezoning and make their determination as necessary, whether they care what we said or not, right? Um, so once again, this is all happens within a 30-day time frame usually, and that basically is the what takes place for the rezoning process for the county. Um, Another thing that we get are PA 116s, which are farmland and open space preservation. PA 116, it was formerly called PA 116, which states it stems from the 1974 legislation that's since been changed or amended in 1994. And it basically provides tax incentives for participating property owners. And this is a program that we live in Oakland County. Um, there are development pressures. So to keep, and we don't have as much farming as we used to. If you even looked at that aerial that I just showed of the county campus, I mean, we used to be covered with orchards in Oakland County, and there's less and less of those as time goes on. Um, so through the state of Michigan, through MDARD, applications for farmland open space preservation can be obtained. They're sent to the town. Typically, it's a township. I don't think I've had one that hasn't been a township. Uh, and then municipalities will send us the review for to look it over, and then I will go through a myriad of when it gets submitted. I'll review the application, confirm the owner and the acreage that they want to preserve and protect and use. We will analyze farmland availability, so I'll use those aerials once again to look at past and present operations on the property as close as we can. I mean, obviously it's 2025, so if you were to submit one tomorrow, I can only go back as far as 2025, but there are other opportunities out there. There's other mapping systems that you might be able to look at as well. We'll review the community's master plan since we probably already have reviewed it, their future land use plan since we already have, and look at their current zoning from an Oakland County standpoint, and basically acknowledge the master plan's adoption date and that we reviewed their master plan and that we know about this farmland or we know about their intentions to preserve farmland or whatever the master plan says in it, and the municipality land uses that are adjacent if appropriate, if there's any. Sometimes these are in the middle of a township, in all honesty. And then we make a recommendation back to MDARD through that approval process, through their application, and a copy is sent to the township as well, or we use the township as the intermediary where we just send them back our review and they can deal with the state. And the state can always contact us if they have any questions. So that's pretty much the process that Oakland County partakes in when it comes to our review function and land uses. The PA 116 does not go before the coordinating zoning committee. I just wanted to make that aware, but I will make them aware that we had one come through and it'll be a file and receive at our next meeting. My department is, or my office is planning land use and zoning, or planning, zoning, and land use. So we are within the economic development structure of the county, which is this huge grouping here. So we are that red group, and I'm within there. This is where we work on the right, and our Cleo is our new manager. I work under Ryan with Maddie and myself. Kristen is in charge of trails and transportation environment, and John Bry is in charge of the Main Street group. There are currently 30, I think 30 communities in Main Street. There's about what 12 to 15 in the NOHAS system. We handle a lot within our office, and it's all kind of draped under planning. So don't be too confused by that. But we're all here to help. Brad and Madeline are brownfield people as well. So we got a lot of people doing a lot of different things in the element of planning in our office. Once again, I'm Scott Kree. I'm principal planner. Here I'm available whenever we do get questions. Ryan and I will field questions from realtors and property owners on a weekly basis. And that's about it. We have time for some questions. I think I was decent on time today.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, great job, Scott. Thank you. We do have some questions. So the first question, given the wealth of state parklands, is the MDNR parks communicated or CC'd on changes that are occurring in the county?
No, they are not. If there is something going on with parks, we rely on either Oakland County Parks or the state of Michigan, the DNR, I guess, and that's what they were referring to.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, but usually the only reason why we would confer with them is because there's a change going on along a border of theirs. We would not just they wouldn't be blanketly part of our correspondence because we don't want to really dilute the reasoning for us contacting them. So it would have to be there's some sort of change going on the border of their property, basically, is why we would contact them. But
Okay, so they're not part of the jurisdictions that we would communicate with when we're setting that
no, I
recommendation.
mean,
Those
Oakland County
forms.
parks we look at mostly. I mean, because that's underneath our thing, our
Mhm.
umbrella of departments.
Okay. So we have, we have this. So this question is getting at the number of communities that are in the county, 62 going on 63. How many master plan amendments or updates do you typically receive during the year? And then what about rezoning cases?
Yeah, on average, we receive about between 10 and 12, almost one a month when it comes to master plans. Rezonings are a little bit less, I would say about three. Granted, rezonings, we're only talking about rezonings that happen along a community border, and it's only for townships, so it doesn't involve all 63 communities. So if like a city wants to rezone property on their border, they're allowed to do that. Same with a village without a review from our office. So the township rezoning function is much lower. So about three, sometimes five, it depends. We've had instances where a township rezones a cluster of properties, which is hard. But they might change a land use of some sort, which requires a rezoning. So we'll look at that. But yeah, for the most part, it's about 10 or 12. But COVID threw a wrench into that. I think in the aftermath of COVID, I think one year I received only three master plans. Granted, planning commissions weren't meeting. There was other things going on in the world, and master plans were not on the top of that list. Since then, we had a backlog. So I think there was one year where I got 14 because the things kind of got held up in the system. So, but on
Yeah.
rule of thumb, it's I'd say 10 or 12
Okay.
plans.
And then, so this is our community's beginning the process to update our plan, um, sending out. So what resources do you recommend or have that would assist?
So yeah, it pertains to what kind of community you are. Not all the resources that we have are going to be applicable to every single community in the county. You're always the community is always welcome to reach out to us and we can figure that out. There's multitude of resources out there, but I would really rely on your planning consultant for the most part, if you have one, which I would recommend. There's a multitude of them that I work with, and they all have their ways of doing things. So I get used to a certain plan that comes from a certain company. And it's like, okay, yeah, they're going to touch on this, this, and this, you know. And the thing is, that's nice is that my recommendations, I try to put less recommendations in my, you know, as things are checked off the boxes. And I'm always willing to have an open conversation with any community if they're looking for certain things. I will go to a planning commission meeting or to an open house just to see what the community is talking about, to kind of give myself a heads up if I know that they're starting to renew update their master plan or amend it. But I won't comment on it. I just want to see that for my own eyes. Yeah, Ryan or I are always welcome to answer any questions of topics. And, you know, like right now, like data centers are a big topic. Sand and gravel is a big topic. Solar and wind are big topics for some of our communities that, you know, we have certain best practices and places that we can send you to get more information or what the county is looking at doing in those areas.
Thank you. Yeah, and I'll add on too, being that, the comment review period is sort of towards the end of the process for communities. We're reviewing a draft plan at that point. Sometimes the recommendations we make may not be timely in terms of integrating them into the plan. So I just want to say, if you're a community that's issuing a letter of intent, that's a great time to reach out to us to gather our thoughts and input on information and resources we could share. So I just want to plug that as an opportunity for you if you're in the process to reach out to us a little bit further ahead of or while you're developing the draft to so that we could try to help and assist. Um, so that's all the questions we had today. So I want to first I want to thank Scott. He did a great job outlining the review function here at the office. I also want to thank all of you for attending, and I look forward to seeing you at our next planners gathering, which is scheduled for October 28th. We'll have a presentation on planning ethics, and we have Ralph Wilmer, who is the ethics officer for American Planning Association. So again, thanks for joining. Have a wonderful day.